Dive into the clash of power and prejudice as Karoline Leavitt confronts a tyrannical liberal manager and rises above political bigotry with a fiery defense of dignity and respect. Subscribe, like, and comment to witness every bold revelation and explosive comeback in the culture wars. The gleaming showroom of Capital Luxury Motors stood as a temple to American success, polished floors reflecting ambition and vehicles embodying dreams that transcended political divides. Or so they should have. Cal Morgan brings you the moment when that illusion shattered beneath the confident steps of Karoline Leavitt. The youngest White House press secretary in Trump administration history entered the dealership with the purposeful stride that had carried her through the halls of power. Sunlight caught the subtle golden glint of her MAGA necklace as she approached the sleek azure coupe, its cobalt finish matching the sharp intelligence in her eyes. "I've had my eye on this model for months," Karoline remarked to the young salesman Daniel, who nodded enthusiastically until shadow fell across them both. Blake Thompson, the dealership's manager, had materialized with a coldness that changed the air itself. "We don't serve her kind here," Blake announced, not to Karoline but about her, as though her presence had rendered her less than human. "This is a socially conscious establishment." Daniel's expression faltered between professional obligation and discomfort. The showroom, moments before buzzing with possibility, fell silent as other customers turned to witness America's division personified. "Excuse me?" Karoline's voice remained measured, the same control that had faced down hostile press corps now deployed in this unexpected battlefield. "Your necklace says everything I need to know," Blake continued, gesturing dismissively. "Capital Luxury Motors doesn't align with MAGA values. I'm sure you can find something more appropriate elsewhere." Karoline's spine straightened imperceptibly. This wasn't the West Wing, but the principles remained the same. Dignity under fire, resolve in the face of prejudice. The irony hung thick in the air, a man claiming social consciousness, while practicing the very discrimination he professed to oppose. She could have walked away, could have leveraged her position, threatened exposure. Instead, Karoline Leavitt simply met Blake Thompson's gaze with the steady look of someone who had navigated harder waters than this shallow pool of political bigotry. "I came to purchase a car," she stated plainly, "not to have my character judged by someone who knows nothing about me beyond a piece of jewelry." What nobody in the showroom realized, not Blake with his performative righteousness, not Daniel with his conflicted loyalty, not even the other customers frozen in their uncomfortable witness, was that this moment would cascade into consequences none could predict. The battle lines of America's culture war had just been drawn in the most unexpected of places, and neither side would retreat without a fight. The tension in Capital Luxury Motors crystallized as Blake Thompson's gaze hardened on Karoline's MAGA necklace. Cal Morgan continues the story of how American polarization transforms even the most mundane transactions into ideological battlegrounds. Blake circled Karoline like a predator assessing prey, his voice rising deliberately to ensure every ear in the showroom could bear witness. "I'm sorry, but we can't accept your money." His pause was calculated, dripping with disdain. "We have standards about whose business we welcome, and frankly, dirty MAGA money doesn't meet them." Heads turned. Whispers erupted among the other customers. Daniel, the young salesman, shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between his manager and the woman he'd been eager to help moments before. "I wasn't aware that American currency carried political affiliations," Karoline replied, her voice steady despite the public humiliation unfolding around her. She'd faced hostile press briefings that had prepared her for moments precisely like this, when composure became both weapon and shield. "Don't play innocent," Blake countered, gesturing to another employee who quickly stepped away, unwilling to participate. "Everyone knows what you people stand for. Do you really think someone like you deserves an Azure coupe? This is a vehicle for people with ethical standards." An older couple nearby gathered their belongings and quietly exited, discomfort evident in their hurried movements. Others remained, spectators to America's division playing out before luxury vehicles that suddenly seemed secondary to the cultural collision at hand. Karoline inhaled slowly, her professional training evident in how she recalibrated. "Mr. Thompson, I require this specific vehicle for my work responsibilities. I'm prepared to pay the asking price in full. My political affiliations have no bearing on this transaction." Blake's laughter cut through the showroom, sharp, performative, and designed to wound. "Oh, I'm sure the White House has many luxury vehicles already. One less won't hurt your propaganda machine." "This is discrimination," Karoline stated plainly, not an accusation but as fact. "Would you treat all your customers this way if you disagreed with their politics?" Daniel, caught between professional obligation and the crossfire of America's culture war, stepped forward slightly. "Sir, perhaps we should stay out of this," Blake snapped, never taking his eyes off Karoline. "Ms. Leavitt knows exactly what she represents. The question is whether she has the decency to take her business elsewhere." Karoline squared her shoulders, a gesture familiar to anyone who had watched her briefings. The showroom had become another kind of podium, and retreat was not in her vocabulary. "I'll wait to speak with someone who remembers that commerce in America doesn't require ideological purity tests," she replied, settling into one of the showroom's leather chairs with the calm determination of someone who had weathered fiercer storms. What Blake Thompson couldn't comprehend in that moment of perceived victory was how quickly fortunes could change when prejudice is confused with principle. The wheels of consequence were already turning, set in motion by his public display of contempt, and neither he nor Karoline could predict where they would stop. In the hushed aftermath of Blake's tirade, the showroom air hung thick with tension as Cal Morgan continues the account of a luxury car purchase transformed into ideological warfare. Karoline stood motionless, absorbing the full brunt of Blake Thompson's public contempt. His voice still echoed against the polished surfaces of Capital Luxury Motors, but something had shifted in the atmosphere, a subtle recalibration of power that Blake, in his smugness, failed to detect. "I think we're done here," Karoline said, her voice low but carrying clearly across the showroom floor. "But understand this isn't over." As she gathered her designer handbag, Blake's mouth curved into a victorious smirk, the expression of a man who believed he'd just won a cultural skirmish in America's endless internal war. "Don't let the door hit your MAGA hat on the way out," he called after her, playing to the remaining audience of uncomfortable onlookers. Karoline paused at the threshold, silhouetted against the afternoon sun streaming through the glass doors. Without turning, she delivered her parting words with practiced precision. "Misjudging opponents is a dangerous habit, Mr. Thompson." The automated doors whispered closed behind her, sealing off Blake's derisive laughter. In the parking lot, Karoline's composed facade remained intact as she slipped behind the wheel of her current vehicle, a testament to achievements Blake couldn't begin to comprehend. Her hands, steady on the steering wheel, betrayed nothing of the storm brewing within. What Blake Thompson had failed to recognize in Karoline Leavitt was a fundamental truth about those who survive the crucible of Washington politics. They don't break under pressure, they calcify. Every dismissive media interrogation, every social media attack, every public attempt at humiliation had formed protective layers around her resolve. Daniel watched from the window as Karoline's car pulled away, a heaviness settling in his chest. He'd witnessed something ugly today, something that transcended car sales and spoke to the fracturing of common courtesy in American life. "That's how you handle these people," Blake announced, to no one in particular, straightening his tie with theatrical self-satisfaction. "They need to know their place." But as Karoline merged into traffic, her phone already in hand, what looked like retreat was merely strategic withdrawal. The wife of Nicholas Rio, a man whose business connections spanned the entirety of the eastern seaboard, Karoline understood, patiently awaiting the most advantageous moment to act. The confrontation that had just transpired wasn't about an Azure coupe anymore. It had escalated beyond commerce into something far more consequential, a battle over whether Americans could coexist despite their differences. As her car disappeared around the corner, the true contest was only beginning to take shape, with forces already in motion that would soon return to Capital Luxury Motors, with the unstoppable momentum of justice delayed, but not denied. The cellular connection crackled as Karoline's voice, taut with controlled rage, relayed Blake Thompson's public humiliation to her husband. Nicholas Rio sat motionless in his corner office overlooking the Potomac, the skyline of power, a fitting backdrop for a man who'd built an empire from nothing but grit and calculated risk. His free hand curled into a fist as Karoline recounted each dismissive word, each sneering gesture. The veteran of 1,000 negotiations and hardball deals, Nicholas had developed an almost supernatural ability to mask emotion, but not today, not when it involved Karoline. "He said what?" The question emerged as barely more than a whisper, yet carried the unmistakable weight of promised consequences. Nicholas listened, his silence more terrifying than any outburst. Unlike the dealership manager who'd flexed his momentary authority with theatrical self-importance, Nicholas belonged to that rare breed of men whose power ran too deep to require demonstration. He'd survived bankruptcy at 23, death threats from displaced competitors, and the kind of political opposition that would have crushed lesser men. "I understand, Karoline. I'll handle it," he finally responded, his voice returned to its customary calm. "And no, not like last time in Boston. This requires a more personal touch." He ended the call and summoned his assistant with a single keystroke. Within moments, detailed profiles of Blake Thompson and Capital Luxury Motors materialized on his screen. Financial records, property holdings, outstanding debts, and personal associations laid bare like battlefield intelligence. Nicholas traced a finger across the gleaming surface of his desk, the same deliberate motion a surgeon might use before making the first incision. "Anthony," he addressed his assistant, who appeared silently at the doorway, "clear my afternoon, and have the car brought around." As he rose, adjusting cufflinks monogrammed with his family crest, Nicholas permitted himself the smallest smile. Not of pleasure, but of purpose. Blake Thompson had made a critical error in judgment, mistaking political difference for permission to dishonor a woman whose husband had built a fortune by recognizing the exact moment opponents had overextended themselves. In the elevator descending to the garage, Nicholas loosened his tie slightly. This confrontation wouldn't require boardroom formality. It needed something far more primordial, a reminder that beneath America's veneer of civilization, respect still occasionally required enforcement. "The dealership address?" his driver inquired as Nicholas settled into the leather back seat. "Capital Luxury Motors," he replied, his gaze fixed on the passing cityscape, where every building seemed to whisper secrets of power and vulnerability. "I believe they need a lesson in customer service." As the car merged into traffic, Nicholas rehearsed not threats, but truths. Words that would strip away Blake Thompson's smug certainty and replace it with something Nicholas had learned early in life was far more effective than intimidation: the uncomfortable recognition of one's own moral failure. Dawn broke over Washington, D.C. with the promise of reckoning. The morning commuters hurrying past Capital Luxury Motors paid little attention to the gleaming windows that had, just yesterday, framed Karoline Leavitt's humiliation. Inside, Blake Thompson moved between luxury vehicles with the easy confidence of a man who believed his small kingdom secure, unaware that the foundations of his certainty were about to be dramatically upended. The first indication came as a distant mechanical growl, a sound both elegant and threatening, like thunder dressed in evening wear. Heads turned on the street as a fiery red Rolls-Royce Phantom, not merely transportation but a $1.5 million statement of intent, sliced through traffic with predatory grace. Behind the wheel, Nicholas Rio's expression remained impassive. The real estate mogul navigated with the same calculated precision he applied to boardroom takeovers and political donations. This vehicle, selected specifically for this moment, represented more than wealth. In the cultural battleground of modern America, it served as a blazing standard, a defiant emblem of conservative success that refused to apologize for its existence. The Phantom's arrival at the dealership entrance created an almost physical disruption in the atmosphere. Conversations halted mid-sentence. The pristine engine purred to silence, and for 3 devastating seconds, nothing moved. Daniel, the young associate who had witnessed Karoline's treatment the day before, stood frozen beside a German sedan, recognition dawning in his eyes. Blake emerged from his office, drawn by the curious silence, his practiced smile faltering as he took in the scene unfolding on his forecourt. When Nicholas Rio finally emerged from the Rolls-Royce, he did so without hurry. His bespoke suit and quiet confidence formed a second layer of armor around him. He surveyed the showroom through the glass frontage, not yet entering, allowing the gravitational weight of his presence to register fully. "Is that?" one of the salespeople whispered. "Nicholas Rio," another confirmed, the name traveling through the showroom like a cold draft. Blake's complexion shifted almost imperceptibly toward ash. The smugness that had radiated from him during Karoline's visit evaporated under the heat of sudden, unwelcome understanding. The Phantom's ruby paintwork caught the morning sun, transforming the vehicle into something that appeared to be hewn from raw flame, a mechanical manifestation of the confrontation to come. In the politically charged atmosphere of Washington, where power constantly shifted between competing ideologies, this moment crystallized something essential. The Rolls-Royce stood as both challenge and accusation, its very presence demolishing the artificial barriers Blake had erected. Politics had been his shield for discrimination, but wealth, particularly wealth that refused to conform to his expectations of what conservatives could or should possess, rendered that shield transparent. Nicholas straightened his cuffs and began his measured walk toward the entrance, each step carrying the weight of purpose that had built his fortune and now directed his vengeance. The dealership's glass doors parted for Nicholas Rio like water before Moses, not from automated sensors, but from the sheer force of his purpose. The air inside Capital Luxury Motors seemed to compress as he entered, cologne mingling with the scent of leather and fear. Every employee sensed the shift in atmospheric pressure that accompanies true power when it enters a room uninvited. Blake Thompson's eyes darted between Nicholas and the exit, calculating odds that were deteriorating by the second. His political righteousness, so confidently wielded against Karoline yesterday, now appeared as flimsy as campaign promises in December. "Mr. Thompson," Nicholas's voice cut through the showroom's ambient music, "I believe you've already had the pleasure of meeting my wife." Blake attempted a professional smile that died halfway to completion. "Sir, I assure you there's been some misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding occurred," Nicholas interrupted, closing distance with measured steps. "You refused service to Karoline Leavitt over her political affiliations. You attempted to disguise bigotry as principle." The dealership fell into a silence so complete that the soft tick of luxury timepieces became audible. Daniel, watching from behind a display, saw his own uncomfortable complicity reflected in every chrome surface. "I would never," Blake began. "Save it," Nicholas said, not raising his volume but sharpening each syllable. "Your words mean nothing when your actions have spoken so clearly." Other customers began discreetly recording the confrontation, the modern-day Greek chorus of American conflict. The tension that had been building broke temporarily, as Richard Mason emerged from his office, his tailored suit and practiced diplomatic smile suggesting a man accustomed to crisis management. "Mr. Rio, I'm Richard Mason, owner of Capital Luxury Motors. Perhaps we could discuss this in my office." "There's nothing to discuss privately that can't be said here," Nicholas replied. "Your manager discriminated against my wife. Now you have two choices. Complete the sale of the Azure Coupe to Karoline Leavitt today with appropriate apologies, or explain to your board why Capital Motors has become the face of political discrimination in Washington." Blake found his voice again. "You can't just walk in here and threaten." "I'm not threatening," Nicholas cut in. "I'm informing. And understand this clearly. I won't demand your termination today." The unexpected mercy hung in the air for only a moment before Nicholas continued. "Not because you deserve quarter, but because living with the consequences of your actions offers a more valuable lesson. Respect isn't political, it's human. And you will learn to extend it to my wife and the values she represents." Richard Mason's posture shifted subtly, the invisible mathematics of reputation and revenue calculating behind his eyes. He extended his hand toward his office, now genuinely seeking privacy. "The paperwork for the Azure Coupe is ready," Mason said, his voice professionally neutral but eyes sharp with understanding. "Mr. Thompson will not be handling the sale." As they walked toward Mason's office, Nicholas paused beside Blake. His voice dropped to a register meant only for the manager's ears, yet it carried the weight of certainty rather than threat. "Remember this moment when you next presume to judge someone by their political affiliation. Some beliefs can't be safely ignored. Like my belief in consequences." 3 weeks after the showdown at Capital Luxury Motors, Blake Thompson stood in the gilded entrance of the Hamilton Ballroom, his volunteer badge hanging like a scarlet letter against his crisp white shirt. The MAGA Veterans Fundraiser Gala, a sea of red ties and patriotic decorations, was the last place he'd ever imagined himself. Yet here he was, by choice rather than coercion. Karoline Leavitt, resplendent in a midnight blue gown that caught the light as she moved through the crowd, noticed Blake before he saw her. For a moment, recognition flickered across her face, not anger, but something closer to curiosity. The Azure Coupe she'd eventually purchased gleamed in the parking lot outside, a chrome-plated reminder of principles that wouldn't bend to prejudice. "Mr. Thompson," Karoline approached him with the diplomatic poise that had served her well in White House briefing rooms. "I admit, I didn't expect to see you here tonight." Blake's posture stiffened, then relaxed. "Neither did I, to be honest." The ballroom swirled around them, a constellation of power, wealth, and conviction that Blake had previously reduced to caricatures. Now he stood among them as a server rather than a judge. "I've been volunteering with Tom's rehabilitation program," Blake gestured toward a veteran in a wheelchair conversing with Nicholas across the room. "After what happened, I needed to see beyond my assumptions." The unspoken weight of their previous encounter hung between them. Karoline nodded. neither absolving nor condemning him. She understood the complex mathematics of change, how it rarely arrives through argument, but through exposure to the humanity behind opposing viewpoints. As the evening progressed, Blake moved through the crowd, pouring champagne and collecting donations. Each conversation with a veteran like Tom, men and women who had sacrificed limbs, comfort, and mental peace for a country they believed in, chipped away at the monolith of his prejudice. "I used to think you all were just blind followers," Blake confessed to Tom later, as they stood watching a fundraising tally climb on a digital display. "But I was the blind one." Tom laughed, the sound cutting through the orchestral music. "Most of us just want the same things: dignity, purpose, a country that works. We just disagree on the route." Across the room, Nicholas Rio observed the interaction, his arm protectively around Karoline's waist. The man who had promised consequences now witnessed something more powerful than retribution. Transformation. Not complete, not perfect, but the first fissures in a wall of division. "He came," Karoline remarked quietly to her husband, "not because he had to. Sometimes, showing people who you really are accomplishes more than telling them who they should be." Nicholas replied, his voice carrying the weight of experience rather than theory. As the gala reached its crescendo, Blake found himself standing beside Daniel, the young employee who had witnessed his fall at the dealership. They exchanged glances of recognition, two men on different sides of a political divide, but standing on the same ground of reassessment. "Politics makes monsters of people who aren't," Daniel observed, watching Karoline address the crowd with passion and precision. "On both sides." Blake nodded, the simple truth of it settling in his bones. The labels that had seemed so definitive, MAGA, liberal, enemy, ally, began to blur at their edges, revealing the complex humanity they had previously obscured. The Hamilton ballroom glittered with possibility as Karoline Leavitt approached Blake Thompson, the tension of their past encounter hanging in the air like suspended crystal. The fundraiser gala had transformed into a battleground of a different kind, one where reconciliation, not retaliation, would determine the victor. Karoline stood before Blake, her posture regal yet approachable. The azure coupe she'd ultimately purchased from a competing dealership gleamed outside, a chrome testament to principle rather than compromise. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice carrying the measured cadence that had disarmed countless journalists in White House briefings, "I appreciate your presence tonight. It speaks volumes." Blake's eyes, once narrowed in ideological contempt, now held the humbled look of a man seeing beyond his own reflection. The veterans around them, men and women who had sacrificed for ideals rather than political tribes, created a backdrop that dwarfed their previous conflict. "Ms. Leavitt," Blake responded, his voice stripped of its former arrogance, "I owe you a genuine apology. My behavior was inexcusable. I reduced you to a political label rather than seeing your humanity." Across the room, Nicholas Rio observed the exchange, his protective instincts tempered by recognition of something more powerful than vengeance unfolding. The man who had vowed consequences for Blake's prejudice now witnessed redemption's quiet power. Karoline nodded, neither rushing to absolution nor dwelling in grievance. "We all deserve to be judged by our character, not our political affiliations. That courtesy extends to you as well." The orchestra swelled as if scoring this moment of grace. Around them, red ties and conservative badges mingled with those who had crossed political lines to support veterans, a temporary truce in America's cultural Cold War. Nicholas approached, extending his hand to Blake. "Thompson," he acknowledged, "what you've demonstrated takes courage, the willingness to reevaluate deeply held positions. My development company could use someone who understands both sides of our divided marketplace. Would you consider managing our dealership relationships?" Blake's surprise registered visibly, the redemptive arc completing itself in real time. "I would be honored, Mr. Rio." Daniel, watching from nearby, exchanged a knowing glance with Blake, both understanding that rigid ideological fortresses offer poor shelter for growth. Tom, the veteran whose rehabilitation program had provided Blake's first glimpse beyond political caricatures, raised his glass in quiet acknowledgement. His sacrifice transcended partisan divides, a reminder that wounds, whether physical or social, required healing rather than weaponization. As the evening concluded, Karoline addressed the gathered supporters, her words carrying beyond the immediate audience to the larger American experiment. "Our differences needn't define us," she asserted, "but rather remind us that democracy thrives in the space between conviction and compassion." The azure coupe waited outside, no longer a symbol of division, but a vehicle carrying forward a simple truth. Respect cannot be demanded through power, or denied through prejudice. It must be earned and offered through the recognition of our shared humanity, even across America's deepest political chasms. In a deeply polarized America, the story of Karoline Leavitt and Nicholas Rio illuminates the corrosive power of prejudice and the potential for redemption through understanding and respect. Political identities may divide, but empathy and principled action can bridge the chasms. True strength lies not in dominance or exclusion, but in the willingness to challenge injustice with courage and to meet enemies with the chance for change. Karoline Now reminds us, respect cannot be won through exclusion, but through confronting bigotry with dignity and compelling humanity.